Alright, good morning, class. What we're going to be learning today is about the three crisis periods that led American colonists to finally putting an end to the tyranny of British ruling. After years of living underneath British rule, American colonists had enough. British monarchy believed that they had invested a lot of time and money into the colonies during the French and Indian War. So they decided that the taxes they had in Britain already, they should bring into the colonies, which infuriated the colonists. So all these new taxes, without legislation, led to the outbreak of the American War. Now, these new taxes were met with three different things. On a legal scale, they met with them in courts, and when that didn't work, they turned to economic ways with boycotts and avoiding British goods. And when finally they got so frustrated that they just turned to violence. The first tax that British tried to pass is the Stamp Act, which was a tax on all paper products in the colonies. This would be newspapers, legal documents, and licenses like to get married and to send anything out of exports. Now, this infuriated the colonists, and a legal response was led by John Adams, who expressed the displeasure of the colonies. And at the House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry gives his speech called the Virginia Resolves. Now, this meant that only Virginia could tax Virginia. Taxes otherwise undermines the colony's rights. Now, this legal approach was automatically shut down by the British, but now you can watch a short little video on what exactly the Stamp Act did in the colonies.
One of the most well-known taxes levied against England's North American colonies was the Stamp Act. Used to raise funds needed to pay the enormous debt incurred during the French and Indian War and to fund garrisons of British troops remaining in the colonies in Canada, the act required the paper and parchment for all legal documents, newspapers, journals, in fact almost every form of paper used in the colonies, to be imported from London where an existing tax was already in place. The act was met with almost immediate opposition, not so much because of the tax, but because it had been levied without colonial representation in Parliament. Taxation without representation, the rallying cry for the coming revolution, had been born. The act was repealed the very next year, but only in the colonies. The tax on paper and documents remained in force in Great Britain for quite some time. On this 1779 copy of the London Gazette, the stamp can be seen on the same page as a legal notice regarding an update to stamp duties 13 years after the Act's repeal in the colonies. There were several different designs of stamps used, such as this 1746 issue of the London Gazette. A second example, marked specifically for the American colonies, can be seen in this proof sheet from May of 1765. This third example, from both the June 1779 issue of the London Gazette and again in the London Chronicles from 1789, was often stamped in shades of vermilion. Notice that the entire stamp often isn't visible. The tax was required to be paid on the larger parent sheet. Once it had been paid, printers were permitted to trim the sheets to a more manageable size, so long as the stamp was visible somewhere on the final product. If the stamp was accidentally cut off, sheets of the stamps were available to be glued onto legal documents, much like a wax seal might be added. Reproductions of the rubber stamps used for the Stamp Act can be purchased by going to the 18th century section of repropaperwork.com and adding either the early or late Stamp Act stamp to your cart. Cheers!
When the colonists felt like they weren't being respected, it met with a violent response by them, which started when a effigy of a stamp seller was found hanging in a tree. And when people started to know this, Boston citizens came out of their houses and started to gather around. Militia tried to come in and take down the effigy, but a full riot ensues led by the North Boston boys, which was a dramatic and huge brawl between citizens and militia. And when violent responses didn't work, it led to an economic response, where Boston's and other colonies boycotted all English goods. If colonists were caught buying goods, they would be tarred and feathered, which was extremely painful for the skin. And the North Boston boys, who caused the riot, and the Sons of Liberty would go around and do this. Now, the economic response out of all three was the one that hurt England and Parliament the most, because it hit them where it hurt the most, and that was their pockets. So, a year later after the Stamp Act, it is repealed. The declaratory acts gave England the power to tax the colonists any way they wanted, giving them all the power. So this led to the second crisis stage. And just like before, it was met with a legal and violent response. But after the Declaratory Acts, England passed the Townshend Duties Acts, which put a tax on all imports coming into the colonies: glass, paint, tea, anything really that they used. So in a legal response, J. Dickinson writes Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which basically proposed a national government in England, overseas, and a state government in England. Because really, the colonists had a problem with tax, but they had a major problem with not being heard in the government. Now, when King George gets these letters and hears this, he automatically finds it unacceptable, and because a divided nation would look as a weak nation. Obviously, not having their voice heard again, it's met with a violent response by colonists. And in Boston, they really were upset and really kicked up the ante with their violent responses, which led to the fateful Boston Massacre, where it all started with townsmen and a militia getting into a fight. And it escalated, and a whole crowd of people come out into the streets, which leads the militia to come out too. Now, both sides have their own story of the night, and fueled by British side and the court rulings and the newspapers, which heighten the event. Basically, an altercation ensues, and the crowd of people start taunting the militia, telling them to fire, throwing snowballs at them, and finally, the militia had enough and started to shoot, thinking they heard the word fire. Now, Captain Prescott, after 3 or 4 collinsmen were shot, the Captain Prescott orders them to stop and sends them back in. Now, this was a very he said, she said event, so we'll watch this small clip of the reenactment.
The temperature was unusually cold, well below freezing, with a blanket of icy snow covering the ground. That evening, a British sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding the customs house located here. Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrick, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrick with the butt of his musket. Garrick fell to the ground. Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns. The crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm.
Call out the main guard!
While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help.
Call out the main guard!
Captain Preston marched in with 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of up to 300 angry citizens. Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling fire over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting the fire, they're wanting to answer that call, but they can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Palms struck a soldier, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick. Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired. The Boston Massacre began moments later. The other soldiers let loose a fusillade of musket fire. 11 colonials fell.
Once they had fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw this, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of twos and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly claimed that the violent confrontation had been a massacre, a symbol of British tyranny, and they demanded justice. Captain Preston claimed that the shootings had been a tragic accident, but to no avail. On March 13th, Preston and 6 of the 8 enlisted men were indicted for murder. The lawyer defending the British soldiers was John Adams, the same man who would become America's second president. The trial hinged on this question: had the British soldiers acted in self-defense, or did they commit murder?
Now, after this violent outburst in Boston, the Duties Act is repealed and England removes all taxes on the glass and lead, but doesn't on the tea. This is because the East Indian Company was going bankrupt. So they were awarded a monopoly in America. Only their tea would be sold so that they could get their revenues back up. John Adams declares that no tea should be sold in Boston. And just like the boycott, anybody found would be tarred and feathered. This led to the Boston Tea Party, which was a protest by colonists. Now, the North Boston boys dressed up like Mohawk Indians, and it was a very feeble attempt. It was a bunch of white, old George Washington-looking figures dressed up as Indians. Now, they boarded 2 ships and threw $10,000 worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. This was the last straw for England that sets to make an example out of Boston. This was their biggest mistake. And we'll see why after this short video of the Boston Tea Party.
You get Miss Phillips. I'm going to get this story.
Just the tea, men! Remember, we're not to damage anything else. We're just after the tea!
Why are you destroying the tea?
We're protesting unfair taxation. Parliament raised the tea tax over our objections. Maybe next time they'll listen.
No taxation without representation!
Do you know what that means?
Nope, I heard the others saying it.
We've stumbled into the story of a lifetime. I'm going below deck to see what's happening. Stay out of trouble.
Take that, Parliament!
Now, after the Boston Tea Party, England was furious. They were furious and they wanted to make an example out of Boston. Now, they pass the Intolerable Acts of 1774, which closes the ports in Boston, trying to cut off their economy and for their imports and exports. Public assembly was now illegal, which means they couldn't meet as in like church, or the Continental Congress that would eventually come out of this couldn't meet. And British soldiers were sent in and were allowed to live in the houses. These new laws, led to the First Continental Congress, where U.S.'s founding fathers met to debate over the colonies. They established that they would continue to enforce the boycott, started to talk to other countries about the impending war. And finally, they began to arm themselves. Now, the British Army caught wind of this and invaded America and tried to get Adams and Hancock, the two most American leaders at the time, and tried to end the war before it started. However, the famous Paul Revere's Ride warns them at Lexington and the weapons at Concord enough time that when British soldiers arrive, they're nowhere to be found. Now, this is where the war for American independence really begins, and it was all this build up to it during these 3 crisis periods. And the main thing that you should know is the taxation without representation was the main problem. Hope you guys learned a good deal right now, and we'll work on this tomorrow.